Mary Lum Girard's life is one of tragedy. Married to one of Philadelphia's most prominent and wealthy businessmen, Stephen Girard, Mary developed mental health issues when she was in her late 20s. Her husband Stephen had her committed to the Pennsylvania hospital where she would spend the next 25 years before passing away. In 1976, a play called The Insanity of Mary Girard was produced. In the play, it was said that Stephen Girard had lied about his wife's mental illness in order to have Mary committed so that Stephen was free to live his life with mistresses. But is that story true? When delving into the life of Mary Lum Girard, one is met with frustration. There is very little original source material to go on. Researchers and authors have attempted to piece together her life, but as is often the case, many of the authors have taken basic facts and embellished stories based on those facts. These stories are then repeated over the centuries and have worked their way into the historical record. This issue has been compounded by the Pennsylvania's hospital's secret nature regarding Mary and her time at the hospital, as well as the location of where she is buried, which we will talk about a little bit later. All of that being said, there is enough original source material that one can come to certain conclusions about the life of Mary Girard. During this video, I have taken all available evidence and attempted to talk about her life. While I will offer some speculation on events, I have omitted the stories that have been told that have no basis in historical fact. Mary Lum was born on November 17, 1758 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to John Lum and Hannah Tilton. She was baptized on September 1, 1762. John Lum is said to have worked in Philadelphia as a shipbuilder. This information seems pretty solid and is taken from the genealogy of the Lum family, which church records and census information verify. There is virtually nothing known about Mary's childhood in Philadelphia. It is believed that Mary Lum first met Stephen in Philadelphia in early 1777 when she was 18 years old and Stephen was 27. Stephen Girard, a sea captain, had landed in Philadelphia less than a year prior in July of 1776 simply by chance. There have been various stories written about exactly how the couple met, but much of it can't be verified. What is clear is that the couple married at St. Paul's Episcopal Church on 3rd Street on June 6, 1777. The church still stands to this day. Mary clearly changed Stephen's life. While he had talked about leaving Philadelphia and returning to the sea, once he met Mary, Philadelphia became his permanent home, and he never spoke of leaving again. Just 6 weeks after their marriage, on July 22, 1777, Stephen and Mary bought a house in Mount Holly, New Jersey. They opened up a business out of the basement and sold goods such as sugar and molasses. The house located on 211 Mill Street also is still standing. All of this took place while the American Revolution was happening, and interestingly enough, a day after the couple purchased the house in Mount Holly, British General William Howe and the British Army began their campaign of capturing Philadelphia, which they succeeded in doing on September 24, 1777. The Mount Holly house that the Girards had bought served as a good place to lay low while Philadelphia was occupied by the British. After the British evacuated Philadelphia a year later, the Girards would move back to their house on Water Street in Philadelphia. The early years for the couple seemed to be ones of bliss. Mary tended to the house while Stephen made his fortune trading goods using the small fleet of ships that he owned. However, tragedy would strike after just 8 years of marriage. It appears first in Stephen's letters. In June 1785 he writes, quote, "Madam continues in the same state. I fear that this illness will never be cured as long as she lives." It is said that Mary would have fits and she would scream, topple furniture, bang her head against things, and wander off from the house unexpectedly. In late 1785, Stephen took Mary to Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia where she was examined by Dr. Benjamin Rush and Samuel Coates and determined to be insane. Stephen refused to have her committed and took Mary home, still stubbornly refusing to believe that she would not get better. Stephen sent Mary to their house in Mount Holly in the hopes that the fresh air would cure her. It didn't. She was prescribed opium to calm her down temporarily. It would help to some extent, but did nothing to cure her mental instability. While at the Mount Holly house, Mary was cared for by her mother and her sister, as well as a few neighbors. It is unclear exactly the nature of Mary's mental illness or what she was dealing with. However, it is not uncommon for mental illness to suddenly appear later in life. Bipolar disorder can often be something that appears, and Mary, in fact, did have some symptoms of that. 2 years passed with no improvement in Mary's condition, and Stephen Girard took a mistress in early 1787. It is this piece of information that would later be used to say that Stephen was making up the entire story about Mary's mental illness in order to be with a new mistress. However, historical record and common sense seems to indicate that this is not the case. For starters, there were many other witnesses to Mary's illness, such as Samuel Coates and Dr. Benjamin Rush, who had great reputations and would be unlikely to lie about Mary's condition, nor would they have any reason to. Also, Mary's family took care of her while she lived at the Mount Holly house. It would be highly unlikely for them to take care of someone who was not suffering from mental illness. Finally, the fact that Stephen tried for well over 2 years to cure Mary before giving up and moving on with his life is a clear indication that Stephen was willing to try and cure her. Mary would go on to live in the Mount Holly house from 1787 to 1790, while occasionally coming back to their house on Water Street in Philadelphia. Stephen seemed okay with her being cared for in this fashion. However, in 1789 and early 1790, Mary's behavior became more erratic and unpredictable. She would wander off from the house and disappear for periods of time. Stephen soon realized that this situation couldn't continue. On December 31, 1790, Stephen had her admitted to the insanity ward at the Pennsylvania hospital. Here, Mary would spend the rest of her life. Stephen hoped that Mary could get the care she needed at the hospital. Less than 5 months after Mary Girard was admitted to the hospital, she gave birth to a baby girl who was also named Mary. Sadly, the child lived for only 5 months and passed away on August 26, 1791. There is tons of speculation regarding Mary's child. Who was the father? It seems unlikely that it was Stephen, since the couple had been married for 8 years without children. It would also appear that Stephen himself didn't think the child was his, since he essentially denied paternity, refused to raise the child as his own, and simply paid the hospital to take care of the girl. There is some speculation that Stephen might have been aware that Mary was pregnant when she was initially committed to the Pennsylvania hospital, and might have, in fact, been the final straw in making the decision to have her committed. The speculation on this is as follows. It was fine that Mary was staying at Mount Holly and being cared for, but the second she started wandering off and going out with other men while still married to Stephen, that was enough to have her confined. However, there is simply no proof to back up this theory. Mary was moved to a new wing of the hospital in 1797 after it was built. Called the, quote, new house, it was exclusively used for patients suffering from mental illness. Strangely, during her time at the Pennsylvania hospital, Stephen would send one of his mistresses, Polly, to go check on how Mary was doing. By 1814 and 1815, Polly had been reporting to Stephen that Mary's condition had deteriorated. Mary would pass away at the Pennsylvania hospital on September 15, 1815. She had been married to Stephen for 38 years, but only in a happy relationship with Stephen for 8 of those 38 years. A funeral was held for Mary, and she was buried on the hospital grounds. It was reported that Stephen Girard attended the funeral and wept over his wife's body before she was buried. William Wagner described the sad scene as follows, quote, "We all stood about the coffin when Mr. Girard, filled with emotion, stepped forward, kissed his wife's corpse, and his tears moistened her cheek. Stephen then turned to Samuel Coates and said, quote, 'Tis well.'" Just a month after Mary was buried, Stephen donated $2,000 to the Pennsylvania hospital. When Stephen Girard passed away in 1831, he left $30,000 in his will to the hospital, equivalent to just over $1 million today. Stephen had hoped to be buried next to his wife on the hospital grounds. However, by then the hospital stopped burials on their land. So where exactly is Mary Lum Girard buried on the hospital grounds? This is where things begin to get a little bit interesting. Stephen Simpson, who worked for Stephen Girard and who attended the burial of Mary, stated in an 1832 account, quote, "At the request of her husband, she was buried in the lawn on the north front of the hospital, and her grave, marked only by a simple mound of earth, is carefully preserved and may still be seen today." The north side of the hospital would be in this area, which was, at the time, an open grassy area. This seems to be somewhat confirmed in another account by Harry Ingram that described Mary's burial spot as follows, quote, "A lovelier spot could hardly be found within the city. the smooth lawns broken by occasional flower beds, shaded by tall sycamores. This account could also potentially imply that Mary was buried on the north side of the hospital, since it was the most open area in the early 1800s. However, this information is contradicted by a newspaper article from 1899, which clearly states that Mary is buried near the grave of Charles Nichols, and the grave itself was at one time marked with chains and posts, which have since vanished. Charles Nichols' grave is not located on the north side of the hospital, but on the southwest side. Being that this 1899 newspaper account is not firsthand and was written 84 years after Mary's death, it could in fact be inaccurate. However, it is equally as possible that she is buried in the area of Charles Nichols' grave. I will let the viewer decide.
So if Mary Lum is indeed buried near the grave of Charles Nichols, which is right there, she'd be buried somewhere in this grassy area. Whether she's buried here or not, this is a very nice spot to come and sit.
If Mary was buried on the north side of the hospital, it is almost without question that her grave has been disturbed and destroyed. In the late 1800s, the Memorial Pavilion was built on this land. That building was torn down, and the modern hospital was built over this area in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s.
So this used to be the north front of the hospital in 1815, and everything out here would have been an open field of grass, but as you can see now, the modern hospital has been constructed on this site.
Having personally had surgery at the Pennsylvania Hospital in the basement of the Cathcart building, I can tell you for certain that the hospital goes underground. It is a little bit eerie to think that it is possible that you are occupying the previous space of Mary's grave when you are in the basement of the operating room of the Cathcart building. Things get even more bizarre. In 1994, a man by the name of Joseph Vendetti raised money to purchase Mary Lum Girard a gravestone, which he donated to the hospital in the hopes that they would place it in the grassy area next to Charles Nichols' grave where Vendetti believed Mary was buried. The hospital rejected the gravestone, claiming that for one, they had no idea where Mary was buried, and two, they believed it was the family's wish that Mary didn't want her grave marked. Joseph Vendetti started a crusade to bring awareness to this by protesting outside the hospital in the 1990s, wearing a shirt that said, quote, "Pennsylvania Hospital refuses tombstone offer for Mary Lum Girard. Why?" The Pennsylvania Hospital never gave in, and Vendetti eventually moved on to other things. Yet another layer to all of this is on the website StephenGirard.com. When asked where Mary was buried, it is claimed that her body lays underneath the clinic building, which was built in 1868. They cite William Malin for this information, who worked at the hospital in the 1830s. I actually have no idea where the clinic building is, but if I had to guess, I would say it's the building just to the north of the grave of Charles Nichols. For whatever reason, Pennsylvania Hospital does not seem to like to discuss or talk about Mary Lum Girard, or even Stephen Girard for that matter. All patient records, even historic ones, are now apparently closed for research. There was a marker talking about Stephen and Mary that was donated to the hospital in 1903. It is, or was, apparently displayed somewhere, but I've been unable to find it. However, on a recent trip to the hospital, I did find a small marker in the physic garden dedicated to Mary. It was behind a bench that was tucked away in a wooded area, much like Mary, forgotten.